Hello students, welcome to the review for the Unit 3 Part 1 test. It's on Genesis 1 through 9. Remember, all your study materials are on PowerSchool. If you go to the Unit 3 Genesis Part 1 page, and you'll see these are the notes that we took in class. If you continue to scroll down, you have the Quizlet here, the Kahoot here, the writing prompt here, and the rubric for the writing here, and the blank Google slide presentation that I'm going to review with you right now is here, and then the notes that we took in class will be here. So first we have all your study materials. You saw those on PowerSchool. Remember, you can download the Kahoot to the Kahoot app to your Chromebook to study. The other day, we went over the MLA template. The writing portion of your test is going to be a take-home, which you'll write over the weekend and then upload to PowerSchool by Monday. Strike that. Upload to Turnitin.com by Monday, October 28th at midnight. Here's the MLA template here, and there's the rubric here. So the test is going to the writing prompts. The thesis to be argued is Genesis 1 through 9 expresses many truths about God, humanity, and creation that are still relevant to life today. So this is your general thesis, and you're going to provide evidence for this thesis in the form of 2 paragraphs. So let's take a look at the first paragraph. So the first paragraph asks the question, what are the religious truths the authors of Genesis 1 through 9 wanted to express? And religious truths ask questions about the nature of God, humanity, and creation. So you have to answer 2 of these questions here. So what religious truths do the stories express about God, who God is? What religious truths do the stories express about what it means to be a human being? What religious truths do the stories express about creation and how God and humans relate to it? So you only have to pick 2 of these, and then from the stories we've read, which are the first creation story, that's the Genesis 1, the 6-day creation, the second creation story, Genesis 2 and 3, and the fall, that was the creation story about Adam and Eve. Then you have the story of Cain and Abel, and then finally Noah and the flood. So again, you're going to pick 2 of the questions on this slide and give evidence of what you learned from them from these readings. So let's brainstorm a little bit on some examples you could use. So with the first creation story, let's look at some of the religious truths that we would learn from that creation story. Okay, so looking at some of the religious truths from the first creation story, the first question asks, what do we learn about God? And so when we were reviewing this in class, different classes came up with different examples, but one of the things that the first creation story teaches us about God is that ultimately God is the source of life. And he ultimately, as we learned from St. Thomas Aquinas' contingency argument last unit, ultimately the buck has to stop somewhere, and it stops at God. God is the giver of life. He is the creator of life. And so one of the things that this story teaches us about God is that God is the source of life and he is the creator. So this is the truth. Now you have to give an example from this, an example from the Bible that backs up this claim. So this is where what you would either quote or paraphrase the Bible. And remember to cite your source. So you might say, you can either quote it or paraphrase it, but even if you paraphrase, you still need to cite where you got that in the Bible. So you might cite the first verse of Genesis where it says, "In the beginning, God created the earth." So make sure you cite the evidence for that. Another thing we learn from Genesis 1, a really important truth about human beings, is that this is the story where God creates humanity last, to symbolize we're the pinnacle of creation. And this is also where it says we're created in the imago Dei, the image of God. And so this is a fundamental truth about human nature that is core to the way Christians view each other and the world. We're the image of God. And again, get the quote from Scripture to back this up, and then explain, what does this mean? This means that human beings have dignity. To say that we have dignity means we have inherent value. And our value doesn't come from the color of our skin, what country we live in, what sexuality we identify with, our gender. We're all created in the image of God. We all have inherent and equal dignity. So that's a core teaching that we get from Genesis 1. In terms of what do we learn about creation, remember one of the refrains in the poetry of Genesis 1 is it's good. What God created is fundamentally good. Creation's good. Remember, we could compare that to the Enuma Elish. We learned from the Enuma that the competing creation story said that the world wasn't good. It was just the result of a cosmic war, and human beings were created to be slaves. What Genesis teaches us is that God planned creation, that it is ordered because it was created by an intelligence. And that ultimately creation is good, and human beings are very good, it says. And so the fundamental nature of humanity and creation is that it's good. So those are examples of something you learned about God, humans, and creation from Genesis 1. Now let's look at this. And there are others you could put here, by the way. If you think of one that I haven't mentioned, feel free to use it as long as you could back it up with Scripture. I'm just summarizing some examples you could use for the purpose of this review. Now, if we look at the second creation story, the story of the creation of Adam and Eve and the fall, what did we learn about God from this story? One of the things that we see in Genesis 2 compared with Genesis 1 is God is much more anthropomorphic. Anthropomorphism means that you're describing something that's not human with human-like qualities. So in Genesis 2 and 3, we see God molding Adam out of clay. He walks in the garden. So he's a little bit more eminent than transcendent. But one thing we see about God in this story is we see both God's justice. So when Adam and Eve rebel against God, despite the fact that he gave them everything they needed, that wasn't enough, so they take from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they're punished. So our God is a God of justice, but he's also a God of mercy, and that was symbolized by the making of the clothes for Adam and Eve. When they were expelled from the garden, God isn't going to let them just do whatever they want and get away with it. That wouldn't be what a loving parent would do. Yet he shows them continued love and mercy. The clothes are the symbol of the fact that God will continue to love them and be in relationship with them, despite the fact that they have demonstrated that they're not trustworthy and don't want to have a right relationship with God. So that's one of the things that Genesis 2 and 3 demonstrates about God. In terms of human beings, we learn a really important fundamental truth about human nature, that humans, despite the fact that we were created with fundamental goodness, we're also broken. And we see that when you have the fall from grace, they fall out of original justice and original holiness, and we're left in this state called original sin. Remember, original sin is a condition that leaves human beings broken, but it can be cured and overcome with grace. Uh, um, and so this idea of original sin, it explains why when we look around the world, people seem so bad. It also explains the idea that the majority of evil is the result of the abuse of free will. Um, and so uh, this is something that's fundamental to the reality we live in. Why are people so darn bad sometimes? Well, it's because of original sin. We carry with us this weakness. Our will is weak and our intellect is dark. So sometimes we can't really see what's right and true and good. Other times we know what's right intellectually, but we have lack of willpower to choose it. Excuse me, I had to get a drink of water. But those are three truths in that from the story of the fall that are really important for understanding God and human beings. In terms of a truth about creation, um, we have the beautiful symbol of the garden, and the garden is the idea that again, what God creates is good. It's perfect, and God gives us all we need. So the garden is this symbol for God's care um, and protection, and it's a symbol for harmony. And then after the fall from grace, we're expelled from the garden. So it becomes this symbol of what we long for, what we long for what we had with God. Um, and we have this sort of holy longing, it deep written into our core of our human being, our human nature, that we were once in harmony with God, but now we're out of harmony, and we long for that. We want that back. Okay, so in terms of the story of Cain and Abel, what do we learn about God? Again, I think um, that theme of justice and mercy is present. We saw God's justice towards Cain. He had to be punished for what he did to Abel, yet God's merciful. He puts the mark on Cain so that no one will kill him. Now, some of you interpreted that as a harsher punishment, that maybe Cain, it would have been easier if Cain would have been killed. He wouldn't have to deal with the guilt. And I think that's a valid interpretation. It's certainly not the dominant one, I don't think, but it's logical, and I think it's valid. So that's another theme we see. In a different class, in one of our classes, someone said, "What do we learn about God?" She said that He trusts us. And that's a really interesting point. Even after the fall of Adam and Eve, and even though God knows that Cain is going to kill his brother, remember the warning he gives Cain? He says, don't let your emotions, your jealousy, your anger rule over you. He said, sin is like a croucher and it's ready to strike. And so even though God knows ultimately what Cain's going to choose, he still trusts him. He still respects his freedom and his autonomy, and allows Cain to make the decision for himself. That's kind of an amazing thing about God. Sometimes it seems almost illogical, but that's what kind of love is. God has this extravagant love for us where he's going to trust us despite what might seem a better judgment. In terms of human beings, what we see is evidence of the effects of original sin. And I'm going to put OG here as just as a abbreviation, but we see that right after the fall from grace, now we see how Cain's will has become weak, even though he's warned by God. You can overcome it. Don't succumb to original sin. He does. He lets his emotions and his jealousy overpower his will, and he ends up killing his own brother. Another thing you could look at is the idea of jealousy. We're going to see that a lot in the next unit. that human beings are jealous of each other, and the story of Cain and Abel is a parable that kind of teaches us to try to curb that natural tendency toward jealousy. In terms of creation, there's that line where God says that your brother's blood cries out from the very earth. And this is symbolic of the idea that sin affects the sins of human beings affect all of creation. And that's what we're going to see in the flood narrative. The blood of human violence had become uh, so gone into the earth to such an extent that God had to wash it clean. That's why the flood is a beautiful symbol, figuratively, of the washing of the blood. The first blood spilled by Cain and Abel onto the earth, and God ends up washing that blood away with the flood. So we see that sin cycles. So we see the cycle of sin that will eventually lead to the flood. So let's talk a little bit about that. So with the flood, what do we learn about God? Again, we see this idea of his justice and his mercy. Remember when we looked at the Epic of Gilgamesh? Gilgamesh. We saw that the ancient Near Eastern gods, they decide to flood the earth not to bring about divine justice, but because they want to sleep, and they kill everybody arbitrarily. They don't save the innocent and kill the wicked. But what we see in Genesis is God judges that human beings have become so violent and sinful, and their sin had so bloodied the earth that something must be done to restore it. So he brings the flood, but he saves Noah. He doesn't kill innocent people. Our God is a God of justice. He saves Noah and begins again with the flood. He saves also the animals and protects them, but washes the earth clean. Human beings, we see, like I said on the other slide, the cycle of sin out of control. We see the idea that the idea that sin has cycled out of control. Another thing in terms of God and humanity would be this notion of covenant. That God wants to partner with humanity. So partner with humanity. So after the fall, he begins this new attempt at a relationship with humankind. He has this universal covenant between humankind, God, and even the earth. The covenant actually is with the animals and the earth as well. Again, we see the idea that God values creation. It's not just something to be used and abused. And we're going to see in the next unit how this covenant relationship plays out with the family of Abraham. And so again, for creation, we see its value to God, that he saves the animals, and he restores creation to its original integrity. So all of these examples here answer these questions. So what did we learn about God? What did we learn about human beings and creation and God and humanity's relationship with it? So again, you're going to answer 2 of these. And what you're going to do is you're going to explain truths, and you can do them all from one story. You could do one from first story of creation, one from Noah. But if you recall, if you look at the rubric, let's take a look at the rubric real quick. It's here, Genesis writing rubric. Okay, so you have your thesis and then your topic sentences for your 2 paragraphs. Then for your evidence, look, it says you have to have 4 quotes, or 4 quotes. What did I do? 4 quotes or examples to support your arguments. So that's 4 total for both paragraphs. So it would be logical then to have 2 examples for this first question, first paragraph, and then 2 for the second. So this is just for the first paragraph. Now we're going to take a look at the second paragraph. So here's the prompt. How might the religious truths expressed thousands of years ago in Genesis 1 through 9 be relevant or applicable to our lives in the world today? So in answering this paragraph, basically you're taking these truths and you're applying them more specifically to your life and the world today. And in answering paragraph 2, you're going to answer these 2 questions. How do the religious, moral, spiritual truths that you discussed in your first paragraph impact or influence what you think of God and what it means what you now think of God and what it means to be a human and creation? And then the second part is, how might the religious, moral, spiritual truths that you discussed in your first paragraph tell you how to live a life, treat others, and creation? Or how might you live out something expressed in your story in your life at school, your family, or in the world at large outside of your house or home? So you can see that this is where you're trying to really have a personal interpretation. Especially if you're Christian, this is key. These stories were given to us by God so that we would read them, understand them, and act on them. So let's do some brainstorming on ways you could answer this question. Okay, so the first question asks you, how have the truths you've learned change the way you relate to God, your humanity, your human family, and the earth? So what is it? How has it impacted you? And you don't have to be religious to have learned something. So like, for example, I've learned many things from the Buddha, even though I'm not Buddhist. And so even if you don't believe in God, one thing you might have learned about is the idea of Imago Dei, that we're created in the image of God. Now, you might not actually believe in God, but what's the core idea here? The image of God is about human dignity. Something we could also mention is the equality of the human family. God said he made male and female in his image. When God created Eve from Adam's rib, he split Adam in half and created Eve. They're perfect partners. And so we learn something about the human race that even if you don't believe in God, you can agree in this idea of human dignity. This is something that all people can agree upon. And so you have this truth that human beings have dignity inherently. We have value, and we share this value equally, and that we're one human family. And so that's one of the truths. Now, how could this truth impact the way you live your life and treat others? Well, if you see the human family as we're all brothers and sisters, then that should lead us to treat others well. It would lead us to see everyone as a true brother and sister. And so when we see others in the human family hurting, we can't just ignore them or look past them. Sometimes when I'm driving home from work and I see the homeless man on the street, I don't see him as my brother. I try to look past him because I don't want to be bothered by this inconvenience of this person. I don't want to see him and realize that, hey, this person needs help and I owe it to him to help him. So knowing that man is the image of God, it changes the way I treat him. Or think about, maybe there's a student in your class you don't like, you don't get along with, or maybe even a teacher. I went on a retreat once, and the nun leading it, talked about this idea of a shining. How do you spell shining? shining? Shining like the sun shines, a shining, shimmering image of God. And she said, when you have those students in your class that maybe they're always talking out of turn or they never turn in their homework, remember that student is a shining, shimmering image of God. And that phrase has stuck with me all these years. And I use it all the time when I encounter people in my life that, maybe rub me the wrong way. I say in my mind, shining, shimmering image of God. And that changes the way I receive them and I interact with them. I remember that even though maybe there's something that personally I don't like about the person, there's something valuable because God loves that person. That person is a shining, shimmering image of God. Another truth that really comes out clearly is this idea that I am my sister's keeper or my brother's keeper. When Cain is caught in his sin, he lies to God. He says, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" It's the sass is unreal. But the whole story, the whole message of that story is, yeah, you are your brother's keeper. So this begs the question, to what extent are we responsible for one another? So using again maybe the example of a homeless person. I remember once, I remember typically in my interaction with the homeless, it drives my kids insane. If I have the time and the money, I will buy them food. I don't want to give them money in case they're having drug problems. A lot of people on the street have drug problems, and I don't want to enable that dependency. But I remember last year I was at the gas station and there was a young couple who was begging, and they came up to me and asked for money, and I said, well, I'm not going to give you any money, but there was a Wendy's right next to the gas station. I said, but I'll go over to Wendy's and get you some food. What do you want? And so I took their order. I went over to the Wendy's and I got them meals, and I gave them the meals. Because I could have said to myself, well, it's their fault they're on the street, or they're not my responsibility. But the story of Cain and Abel teaches me that I am my brother's keeper. I had, I had the money, I had the time, and I shared my resources with them because they are my brothers, and they needed me. And so, that's how these truths from Genesis are lived out, at least in my life. Other truths that you could talk about all kinds of things. Some students had said it's okay to make mistakes. God always forgives. His love, again, is so extravagant. And knowing that, maybe that means that we have to be like God and forgive. Other students have said, in terms of it being okay to make mistakes, that it's sort of part of human nature, have said that maybe they won't be so hard on themselves, or on others. And so again, with this, make sure to be specific. Be very specific. So don't just say, from my brother's keeper, I learned that I should help the homeless. Be very specific. Say, I learned that I could, perhaps give homeless people a meal. Or the idea of to be like God and forgive. A student in another class said, I learned that God always forgives, so I should be like God. And, there's a person in the past who hurt me and I never forgave them. And I've learned that I need to forgive them. So she was specific, but she didn't have to overshare. I mean, imagine it was like a boyfriend that cheated on you or something. You don't have to overshare, but she was specific. She said, someone hurt me and I didn't forgive them, I should forgive them. So do be very specific. So again, this is the answer to the second paragraph. So let's just recap and review what we're doing here. So again, the idea is Genesis 1-9 expresses many truths about God, humanity, and creation that are still relevant today. That's the overall thesis. Now you're going to demonstrate that. The first thing to do is to prove this point. There's truths about God, humanity, and creation. How are you going to do that? You're going to look at what did you learn about God from these stories. Again, you're going to want 2 examples from here and that's your first paragraph. Then the second paragraph is answering the second part. It's these truths are still relevant today. How are they relevant? You're going to pick one truth that in particular you related with, and then you're going to say how it's relevant in your life. How would it change the way you treat yourself, humanity? We saw the idea that creation is good, and the earth has value. So this could change. Maybe you haven't been recycling, and maybe you need to recycle more or something like that. And so that's how that's the writing prompt. And again, remember, this writing prompt is due to turnitin.com Monday night. And if you're like, well, what about turnitin.com? I don't know the information. If you go to Power School and you open up the Genesis 1 interpretive response, the information for Power School is right here. I mean, not Power School. The information for turnitin.com is right here. And you just use the class ID. The enrollment key is Reagan. And remember, it's going to check for plagiarism, so please don't plagiarize. Make sure you're citing your sources properly. And if you need help with citations, again, if you go on Power School and you go to the go to the Freshman Survival Guide. Here is a template, sample MLA Google Doc. So this shows you how to do MLA. It shows you how to cite the text in the Bible. If you wanted to talk about the problem of evil in that Bishop Barron video, and then if you scroll down, here's the works cited. These are all the sources that we used for this unit. So that's there for you as well. So I hope this is helpful to you. If you have any questions, please let me know. Good luck, and yeah, I'll enjoy reading your responses.